And now to our speaker. Dr. Tukufu Zuberi, its groundbreaking research asks what it means to be human, citizen, and person. He has asked this question as a professor, a television host, a curator of museum exhibits and galleries, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. Tukufu is the Lasry Family Professor of Race Relations and Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. He also holds an appointment at the Annenberg School for Communication. His forthcoming book on written and oral history in pre-colonial West Africa is entitled Black Worlds and Memory Before Destruction. He is a series editor of the General Demography of Africa, a multi-volume series. Among his many publications are the books Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, The Mortality Cost of Colonizing Liberia in the 19th Century, and Thicker Than Blood, How Racial Statistics Lie, as well as African Independence, How Africa Shapes the World. And he has yet another manuscript that I just saw on Timbuktu. His last published book, African Independence, accompanies a film also entitled African Independence, which is an award-winning feature-length documentary that highlights the birth, realization, and problems confronted by the movement to win independence in Africa. Completed in 2020, his feature-length documentary on the history of ancient Ghana, Mali, and Songhay is entitled Before Things Fell Apart, 2020. His most recent short documentary on African material culture in the museums is entitled Decolonizing the Narrative, Africa Galleries from Maker to Museum, also from 2020. The first in a series of 3 short documentaries, Africa Galleries from Maker to Museum is a 33-minute exploration of the debates around museums, repatriations, restitution, and race. Elsewhere in his media career, it's quite likely that many of you have encountered Tukufu in his role as host of the PBS show History Detectives. And to add one more entry to his long list of accomplishments, Tukufu is also an experienced and innovative curator of exhibitions. He has curated Tides of Freedom, African Presence on the Delaware River, which you can see at the Independent Seaport Museum, as well as Black Bodies in Propaganda, the Art of the War Poster, which began here at the Penn Museum and has since been traveling around the country. More recently, but still in our museum, Tukufu has put his energies and expertise into the reinstallation of our Africa galleries, on which he was lead curator. This major new reinstallation, which opened to great acclaim in November 2019, explores and presents our collection as never before, acknowledging their colonial collecting history and embedding them in new narratives. He has also addressed these topics last time he spoke in the Greats series in his presentation, Whose Stuff Is It Anyway? Decolonization and the Role of Museums in Contemporary Society, which is on the Penn Museum's YouTube channel. So now, please join me in welcoming Professor Tukufu Zuberi, who will talk to us about Mansa Musa, a revolutionary view of education and wealth in 14th century Mali. Tukufu?
Okay, probably hear me a little better now, right? I want to thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I hope my comments today kind of represent some sensitivity to that issue. The topic of my conversation today is in large part something that I've been extremely interested in for a very long time. And I don't really know when it started, but I developed a real interest and excitement about Mali, ancient Mali, about Songhai, ancient Songhai, and about Ghana and their relationship to each other. So much so that I remember the first time I was in Mali, I went there for a conference with some people in Bamako. And, we met for about a week on health in Africa, and it was a team that I was collaborating with back in the early parts of the 1990s and early parts of the 200s. And they said, well, Tukufu, we see your ticket doesn't leave for 2 weeks. And I said, I'm not going to come to Mali and not go to Timbuktu. I mean, who comes to Mali and not goes to Timbuktu? And my host said, well, I don't go to Timbuktu. And I told him, you don't see what I see, do you? And he's like, no, I really don't. But tell me about it when you get back. Now, he's a good friend of mine and continues to be a good friend of mine and has hosted me a number of times when I've gone back to Mali. But I came back with more enthusiasm about finding out the story about Timbuktu even more so. And part of my interest in Timbuktu is that I had heard so much, and you all have probably heard this as well, so much about the oral tradition in Africa, the words of the griots and how that is where African history can be found. And, for me, Timbuktu was always the antidote to that confusion, because Timbuktu was one of those spaces in Africa that didn't only have this tremendous tradition of griots recounting African history, but also had this long history of writing in Africa, of producing histories of West Africa, of keeping records and demonstrating the combination of the literal and the oral tradition in preserving African stories. And I had heard a long time ago about these texts. At the time, I thought they were secret, and so I shouldn't say too much about them because I didn't hear about them. I'd taken a lot of African history courses, but these tariqs, Tariq al-Sudan and Tariq al-Sudan and Tariq al, what's the other one? Okay, it's not coming to me right now, but it'll come back here. And these two, Fatish, Tariq al-Sudan and Tariq al-Fatish. And so these two books, which I didn't hear much about, were both written in Timbuktu. And they were both written by scholars in Timbuktu. And both of these texts claimed that they were going to provide a history of the Sudan. And what they meant by the Sudan is what we usually refer to today as West Africa, going all the way up to Timbuktu and beyond. And I was fascinated by this process. And once I got my hands onto copies of these books at the time, I didn't know of any English translations, and there were only the French translations, which, we were all kind of passing around hand to hand once we got French under our belt. And we would read this text and be simply blown away. And I began to ask people, who were talking about West Africa, why weren't these texts the standard texts that people would read? Why didn't people just talk about the tariqs? Now, a couple of years ago, I was in London, and they had a conference on the tariqs, and people were talking about the different ways they used and approached them, and this whole area has found a new flourishing. So me and my part, I decided to have a project in which I would highlight this African perspective about what was happening in the Sudan. That is, I would go around and I would sit at the feet of these griots and I would listen to them sing the song of Timbuktu, sing the song of Gao, sing the song of Jene, and sing the song of Mansa Musa, sing the song of Sundiata, sing all these songs. You might say this guy was listening to a lot of songs. I was. And, you know, and I was drinking a lot of Malian tea. It's delicious if you don't know what I'm talking about. And eating some great food and traveling all around Mali. And it just so happens that I had begun to develop an interest in making documentaries as a result of my experience on PBS. And, you know, as PBS, I did that for like about, 12 or 13 years. And in doing that, I said, I need to learn something else about this, and this is where I put myself in documentary filmmaking school and learned a lot about putting projects together. So I decided I would put a project together on Timbuktu that didn't only use Timbuktu, but how do you tell the story from the perspective of Timbuktu? And what I meant by that is, what if I took these tariqs as being the authoritative source on what happened in Timbuktu? I mean, I know that sounds weird, right? Because you got all these brilliant people digging things out of the ground, having and looking at all these records that were left by these Europeans who visited the area. And those, for the most part, have become the authoritative texts, and not only the European visitors, but also the Arabic visitors. But I thought that it would be interesting to try to recount from these records the history of this particular area. And that's why I was showing, I wrote a book on it. I just haven't published the book. And I was showing Chris the book just a moment ago, saying, now I need to publish this book, and I need to publish it soon. But I'm going to read to you some of the passages from the book. But I also want to give you a sense of the words that kind of invite you to think of the landscape, to think of the architecture, to think of the scale of the people who are in these stories. And I want to focus on Mansa Musa because, in a way, Mansa Musa really serves as a good example of how Africa was viewed at that time and how Africa viewed the rest of the world at that time. And using the life of Mansa Musa, I think you will see that there was a big transition in terms of the view of Africa that was occurring in the 14th century. Because if you imagine what's going on around the world at this moment, Africa is a major player. Not only is it North Africa, but this part of West Africa. Not only is it these parts of West Africa, but we could find similar stories in East Africa, in South Africa as well. Sometimes we forget that Africa was there because there is this big mythology which has been built that, in essence, Africa was kind of discovered. Africa was found out by these Europeans only when the Portuguese put their boats around the coast, and Diaz ends up in southern Africa, and we get a guy named Henry the Navigator because of what they do in bringing the stories about the greatness of Africa to Europe. So in some ways, there is discovery going on, but the discovery is happening in Europe by Europeans. Africans are very aware of themselves, and they are very aware of their relationship with the rest of the world. So the dark continent, which is born in the colonial mind, is not the mind of those Africans who were there before the fall, before colonialism arrives and decimates Africa, and kind of restarts and resets its history, so that we start the narrative often about Africa. We start the narrative by actually looking at where and when Europeans had contact. And we often pull the stories out of that. Well, I want to pull a story out of the words of these griots and out of the words from one of these texts that I will focus on, which is Tariq al-Sudan. And there are reasons that I focus on that, and I want to talk about those reasons. But I want to start by just giving you a brief introduction to the visuality of what I'm saying And what I'm going to show you is just kind of a trailer for the film. The voice that you will hear is Ursula Ruckers. I don't know if you all know who Ursula is, but Ursula is a very powerful and prominent cultural figure here in Philadelphia. Her words are, you know, all over the place, and she's a very important poet, a very important spoken word artist, and she agreed to collaborate with me on interpreting these words. You know, interpretation is always a very complicated matter. And so in some ways, interpretation is always a kind of act you have to go in whenever you translate one word to another. Interpretation is always involved when you go from one language, one conceptualization to another. And so we're starting in this African context, and I asked Ursula to think with me and to reason with me on how to present these words. But in this particular clip, you're going to hear Ursula basically saying some of what I just said in what I would say is probably a little more poetic voice. And here's the clip.
Abd al-Rahman al-Sadi was born on 28 May 1594. In 1656, he completed his chronicle, Tariq al-Sudan, A History of Western Africa. This documentary is inspired by this book and African oral history.
Now, let me give you the scope of the project so you understand what I'm talking about. What you just saw, the last part were two griots singing the story of Gao, singing the story of the foundation of Gao, singing the story of why the mosque in Gao was built, singing the story of the conversion of the king to Islam and all of these things. And they were singing in Jinnakam, and they're singing the lyrics, and they're singing it in their traditional language, and they're talking about it. For Jinneh, there's two Jinnehs. There's the one Jinneh, which is the old Jinneh, and then there's the more recent one, which you can visit where the new mosque is. But their song is basically connecting the history of the two, because it goes back, it's a very long history that goes back to like 600, 700. And then they recount the tale of what he's doing. But they do it in this particular language. And I thought that it was very important to hear, even if one doesn't understand what they're saying, because we have translations of what they said. We have interpretations of the song, as I suggested to you. But to hear what they said in the language that they say it in. Because often we think that the barriers to understanding a history, and especially with Africa, is that nobody cared to write it down. But people did care to write it down. And the vocalization of it, however, carried another element to it. And the rules of doing this, and the rules of griots and passing the stories down, in themselves was a tradition that is very important to understand, right? Because you think about the history that we take, the history that we embrace about any person or anything, and it is often involved in these stories. And these stories invade our public and private spaces. And indeed, the stories about Mali, the stories about Songhai, the stories about Ghana, are all kind of grounded stories in these ways. And some of that hasn't trickled down to the rest of the world because of the mythologies we have about what those stories are. And even some of the dismissal of the possibility that an African would write the history of what is happening in West Africa in the 16th century, in the 17th century, and that they would recount this story, and how this recounting and listening and hearing it gives a certain picture. Now, of course, the picture is full of the mythology, right, of the time, because all these stories are. If you think of the stories and the recounts of the travelers who went to Africa during this period of time, they also had their mythology. They also came with their Christian interpretations and point of views about what was real and what was possible. And so listening to the stories of the griots and reading the text of Tariq al-Sudan, you get a storytelling which is grounded in the narratives, in the stories, in the mythologies, in the cosmologies, which operate in that space at this time, right? Because we often tell histories, but whenever we tell the history, we're really telling the history to answer questions we have now. And in recounting those stories that we have now, I was very interested in capturing that activity on the African continent, and to capture that activity as a group of people who were very proud of their history. I mean, there was no shame in the game of people knowing about Gao and its role and celebration in the history of the area. There was no shame in knowing and telling the story of Mansa Musa and what he meant, and having the people who already have this in their consciousness as they think of who they are, as they think of what Mali could become. So their reference point for Mali is grounded in a narrative about their own history. Those mosques that you saw in this short piece, and I'll show you a couple more pieces in a moment, this mosque and the architectural style, and you know, with the adobe, using the earth and building it with the wood in the area, it all takes on a flavor of itself and is very reflective of the people's involvement with their history. Because one of the things about building on sand is that it moves. And one of the things about building on sand when you're kind of constructing, or you have an old structure, is the structure continues to be built. It all is as if it has a life in itself. And indeed, when they do analysis of these structures, the structures are as tall underground as they are above ground. And part of this is because of the maintenance which is going on perpetually. And it is a community involvement, and a community act is to preserve the architectural structure and form of these buildings. And it is amazing how long they have been there. And it is equally amazing how they appear the same way. So they continue to modify the structure in a way that preserves its architectural structure and form. All right? Let me show you another clip to kind of make my point. Are y'all with me? Everybody following me here? Can I go to the second one? I think this is it. That's it. And that's me driving on a boat on the Niger. And you know, I think we captured this at the moment we wanted to do it. I mean, we were finishing our filming in 2010, 2011, and actually we were leaving Timbuktu, and we passed another crew that was entering Timbuktu at that very moment. You know, we talked and shared some equipment, as I recall it a little bit. We went on to Gao. By the time we got to Gao, the film crew in Timbuktu had been kidnapped, and the civil war in all of Mali flared in a way that they didn't anticipate. We continued to work along with the military, was there by this time, and the whole situation was becoming what it is now. It's been an more on than off kind of civil war going on in Mali. You may have even noticed recently some of the flare from that. But that instability, it happens, and it happened there a lot. But what we were trying to capture as we floated our way through what were some of the lines, some of the veins that existed in this area that would support the rise of Ghana and its fall, and support the rise of Mali and its fall, and support the rise of Songhai and its ultimate fall. And in doing that, we identified, you know, these major cities and decided to focus our attention there. The griots that you just saw were the griots that we encountered in Timbuktu. And so we asked them, as you heard, to sing their song in Tamashek. And so what we did is we heard the song in Songhai, we heard the song in Tamashek, we heard the song in Jinakan, we heard the song in Bambara, we heard the song, and in listening to these songs and listening to the words, so I had several translators who were traveling with us. We were my crew was good. We went someplace and we had the ability to at least communicate through these translators about the work that we were doing. But the way they sung the songs, the amount of instruments they used, the intonation, the which king they decided to praise and how they praised them, and which reference points they used, the inflection they had, all of this was the moment that we were trying to capture. When we sat down to write out the text on what this was about, we said we're going to start with the story that they tell in Tariq al-Sudan. And so we tried to summarize that story from Tariq al-Sudan in our text. And then we said, now we're going to turn to the oral stories. And in each of these places we went and we asked to speak to the griot of the community. And that, you know, it's not, I mean, there's some very famous griots now. There's some very famous people who sing these songs all over the world. But actually, those were not the people I was looking for. I was looking for the people who would sing at a wedding. I was looking for the people who would sing at a traditional ceremony, who would actually be talking to the community about the story and would be telling the story in a way that really resonated with everyone. You know, I remember I was in one place and they told me a story about a snake. It's actually a guy telling me about how the Bozo group took over the traffic on the Niger, and how they did it because of a relationship between two brothers who had been born, and one of them was a snake and one of them was not. And so I spoke with a scholar here about that, whose research is in the area, and I expected, because you know he was from Gao, so I expected him to say, you know, this is just some, and you know what he told me? He said, yeah, that's true, man. I know somebody. And I was like, you know somebody who is a snake? He's like, it's true, Tukufu, you just don't know. And I said, well, where do I find it? He said, you ain't gonna see it even if it's in front of you, because you know you have to know how to tell the story and listen to it. and you ain't ready to listen yet. So I'm still being ready to listen to the snake who's going to talk to me. But none of them didn't do it, at least not while I was not drinking a lot of beer or something like that. So I didn't really get that particular message. Mansa Musa is a very important figure throughout these narratives. And often when one sings the story of Mansa Musa, it starts with the words of, now I'm going to talk about a historic figure. And some of that is based on the idea that Mansa Musa has been one of the most important figures in Mali, and he's probably one of the best known of the kings of Mali. People know about him. They may know a little bit about his grandfather. They may know a little bit about his uncle, but they know about him. If you put Mansa Musa in YouTube or on the internet, it'll flash up the richest man in history, because he's supposed to have more money at that time than Bozo has now. Is his name Bozo? I think his name is Bozo, yeah. I think he had more money than Elon Musk even does now. Now, he probably doesn't have more money, or he's not, because he's reported to have had $400 billion. Now, I was very interested in this because I was like, okay, they've determined that he's the richest man in the world. What else do they say? So I looked at a few of these YouTube videos about him, and they did get part of it right. That is, he was a very wealthy person. He was the king of a very wealthy empire, but almost everything else they said about him was wrong. What they said about he built was wrong. What they said about who he was wrong. What they said about his brother, his older brother, was wrong. What they said about his older brother leaving Mali and going to along with 3,000 ships on a journey to find the Americas was wrong. I mean, that is, he did have, Abubakar II did exist, and he did, in fact, take boats and went to the sea, but, nobody knows what happened after that. Although there's an entire growing field of historians who claim that he arrived and that the evidence is here in the Americas, in Greenland, in different parts of Latin America, and reflected in the Olmec heads. You probably have heard some of that, so that the story hasn't died down in terms of his relationship or in terms of these other individuals and their fame as being leaders of Mali. But Mali's story and its founding is also a very powerful story. And so I want to just read you a little bit about the founding of Mali and the creation of Mali. And some of this is kind of my translation, my interpretation of these griot stories, and then using Tariq al-Sudan as a back text to support some of the things that I know. Now, of course, I've read a lot of modern books about the history of Mali, about the history of Mansa Musa, but I'm just using, and I'm doing something I know it's exceptional, but I'm using the words of these Africans as being the most important text written about Mali and written about Mansa Musa. I'm taking these stories that you can go and hear in Mali sung by these griots as an important message on how people remember their history, and how that history may not be the one that you know, and it may actually capture something very big. Mali was found in the wake of the disappearance of Ghana. And Ghana kind of fell as a consequence of internal fighting inside of what is called the Sudan, this area of West Africa. So a battle kind of defines the beginning of Mali's history. And this battle and Sundiata's role in it is pivotal to understanding what the significance is of what Mansa Musa did to transform this budding kingdom into an empire that had an international reputation, and to lead up to his own pilgrimage, which had this profound impact on the world, if you will, and put that in some context with you. But first, let me just talk about this battle. Now, on the day of the battle, the sun had risen and lit the river and the whole plain. Thousands of cavalry and infantry from the Soso and Mali armies faced each other with the Niger as a backdrop. The smell of battle hung in the air as the men prepared for the fight. When at last Sundiata gave the command for his foot soldiers and cavalry to charge across the plain, the archers stood in the rear guard, covering the high ground. With great courage, the foot soldiers charged toward the river and the Soso forces. Sundiata's cavalry was stopped by Soso horsemen, and the death fight began. As the sun continued to rise and beam an unrelenting ray onto the battlefield, the action spread over the plain. The Soso and Mali armies clashed with a clang. Their horses slammed together and their shields scraped as the men pounded one another in a death struggle. Screams of defeat and cries of triumph filled the air. The roar of the struggle rocked the earth. Many men on both sides died, and blood covered the sand. Slaughtered men with severed limbs lay everywhere. In a decisive moment in the battle, Sundiata did not blink. He sat on his horse in control. He was tense but not afraid. The moment he had a clear shot, he struck the king of Soso with his specially prepared silver arrow. The arrow pierced the emperor's armor, and the point came ripping out the other side of Samaguru's arm. Samaguru was the king of Soso. Soso gave the final death blow to Ghana, or what was called Ouagadougou at that time. And so Samaguru was shot by a Sundiata, and he died. He didn't die immediately. So the wounded emperor, he turned his horse and he fled from the battlefield. This caused confusion and panic among his troops, and the outnumbered Malian forces took advantage of the situation and won the battle. Now, in many ways, this battle reflects war as it was fought in the days of the Western Sudan. Sundiata was legendarily thought to have been a magical warrior with superhuman powers. This is almost certainly due to his military genius and his significance in the history of the Western Sudan. The empire of Soso replaced Ouagadougou as the regional power. Ghana was no more, and Mali was now here. The imminence of this empire, the growth of this empire, embraced much of what had been Ouagadougou and added to it these other areas, especially Gao. But on this day, in around 1240, 1250, the world changed. One empire died and another was born. The larger Soso army was defeated. That the large Soso army was defeated was also, it was already unimaginable. How could this possibly happen to the people of the Western Sudan? How could there be a change with such a great force on one side? Sundiata would go to lead several other battles which were decisive in building the Mali that would be the Mali, creating the narrative that would kind of really foreshadow where it would go. So what Sundiata did that no one had ever done before is he was able to come in and to unify the kingdoms of Ouagadougou and provide a context for unifying all of the states around the Niger and further south, and further north, I'm sorry. The war at Karina, which is the war I just recounted, was a turning point for Mali, but it also showed how the history of this empire would be recounted through the acts of the emperor. So in some way, talking about Sundiata's very important role in this battle was the way to tell the story not only about Sundiata, that is to recount his acts, but also to tell a story about the origin of this nation and how, or this empire, and how it was connected to the empire which came before it, which is Ghana. I mean, we usually call it Ghana, but in that context, it's Ouagadougou, which would have been the name that people would use about it. But you know, really, this is not the story that we hear in terms of the fame of Mansa Musa. The fame of Mansa Musa, we get more so from his pilgrimage. We get more so by a recounting of his Hajj, his making Hajj, and what happened during this period when he made Hajj and why it was so important. And in one way to look at that story or to tell that story is by what he did during his Hajj that was exceptional. First, he was an extremely wealthy individual and had access to the resources and the wealth of Mali, which was one of the most wealthy empires at this point. So in the 14th century, in the 1300s, Mali was probably the most wealthy nation, kingdom, empire on the planet. And in part, this was due because of the wealth that it had in gold. So when Mansa Musa went on his Hajj to Mecca, he took a Saharan route, and in this route, he built a number of mosques in each of the major cities that he stopped. So he built a mosque in Gao, he built a mosque in Timbuktu, he built a mosque in Cairo, he built a mosque. So he built a number of mosques, but he also gave away so many tons of gold, which he had in his entourage to people. And so in some ways, what he was building was a statement about his trek, that is, you know, how he would make the Hajj, and he would give so much money to the poor, so much money to the various kingdoms that he encountered, but also kind of his contribution to the legacy of what education meant in this area of the world, and the kind of how commerce would happen and how the people who engaged in business would be protected. So Mansa Musa's construction of a mosque and a palace in around 1325 began a very new era in which Timbuktu developed an aura of religious piety, of religious sanctity, of just religious importance in the entire region, and also as a major place of learning, of Islamic learning. As the empire became more established, part of the focus turned from outward growth to inward development. That is, as Mansa Musa consolidated what Sundiata had conquered, and as he consolidated what he himself had contributed to what would be Mali. So that in this context of support, the development of Timbuktu's educational tradition flourished and began to play a vital role in the development of arts and sciences. So the Mansa contributed to this tradition by attracting scholars from other Islamic centers to Timbuktu and sending people from his empire to study in Morocco and Egypt. The the settlers from Ouagadougou, that is, many of the people who left Ouagadougou after it fell, they moved to Timbuktu. So rather than just dispersing, many of those scholars moved to Timbuktu, and they became the professors in the universities, and they became the judges, the people who administered many aspects of the society. The settlers commanded considerable knowledge and wealth, along with the international networks of trade and political alliances. The men of learning became the guardians of the city, the mosques, the schools, the shrines, and the sacred history of the city. So that there were, so there's a number of very important mosques inside of Timbuktu. One is called the Friday Mosque, the other one is called Sankore Mosque, and there's a couple of others which were built during this time as well. So these mosques were, Sankore, which was already there, was refortified by Mansa Musa, but Djenguereber, which is the Friday Mosque, was built by an architect from Cairo who Mansa Musa hired to come there and build this mosque. And the mosque served also as a madrasa. It served also as a place of learning, an educational institution. And so when Mansa Musa would build these mosques, he would also provide for intellectuals to come and be at the mosque as a way of educating the general public about what was going on. Okay. Now I think I've gone to about where I wanted to go, but let me end with one note. So in the film, let me tell you about what I do in the film. I showed the film in various festivals during the pandemic around the world, and it got a very interesting reception. Some of it we've taken into consideration as we kind of finalize what we will do with it. But one of the distinct things we got out of it is this idea of how people in this part of the world remember their history, and how important that remembering of their history is for understanding who they are and for understanding how they see their future going forward. The ability to look at both the material culture, and in this case it's in the architecture, and the way that people preserve this architecture as both a community project of construction, but also as a community project of remembering, a community project of establishing what has happened and what can happen. Was the beauty of the narrative. So part of it is Mansa Musa was wealthy, yes, but he was wealthy as the empire, as his empire was wealthy. He was wealthy because his empire was wealthy. And so, you know, just like you probably could look at some place like Saudi Arabia and say that the prince who is there now is one of the wealthiest men in the world. Maybe he's a trillionaire by virtue of him having access to the resources of his kingdom. Well, Mansa Musa was the richest man in the world because he had access to the wealth of his kingdom. And he used that wealth to further learning, to further the religious practice of Islam, but to also provide a venue in which the city of Timbuktu could be a center of education, you know, having as many as 20,000 students studying there at the various mosques at some points, and then having a very intimate connection with the other centers of Islamic learning, whether it was in Morocco or in Cairo or in other parts of the world at that time. Thank you very much. I think I'm going to stop there, and we can have a conversation if you have questions or statements, and I can go further. Thank you.